Um, but, but of course, if you need to ask some questions or clarify the questions, then please we'll unmute you. So just in the chat room, use that facility to let us know that you'd like to clarify the question. And if you're going to ask a question in the chat function, please just type in a Q beforehand so we can separate those out from any comments. And my colleague Rasilla is here to look at the questions. She's waving, and also to ask the questions of Graham afterwards. So let me now introduce our guest speaker. It's Graham Setter. Graham is the chairman of the Setters Group, which has been in existence for 29 years. It's focused on people engagement and performance coaching in health, safety, and well-being. His whole working career has been involved in high-risk sectors, including steelworks, construction, manufacturing, and ultimately oil and gas. And this is as an offshore installation manager. And that was all prior to establishing Setters. So the presentation overview is about what's happened over the last few decades and how we've successfully raised the level of workplace safety consciousness and driven down accident rates and severity. However, most of us realize we have now reached a plateau in performance. And those of you who listened to the serious injury and fatality, the SIF presentation that we did, I think it was last year, you'll see some connection with this, I think. So Graham will share with us the need for a step change in thinking to move off the plateau to the next level of performance. And I think with the latest fatal accident results which came out from HSE last week, which from memory, is it 172, I remember, and I think last year 111, the time is right for this message. So without any further ado, please welcome Graham. And Graham, it's over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, welcome everybody, and a good evening to you wherever you are. I hope you're enjoying the heat like we are here in sunny North Wales. So I thought it's a shame really that I'm not face to face with you, because I kind of really like to operate when I'm asking questions. So I will be still asking questions, it's a habit. But they're almost kind of rhetorical questions because I know I can't get an answer. So I'm very happy if you put things in the chat. Priscilla knows me very well. She's quite comfortable to interrupt me at appropriate times. There's no problem with that at all. So put stuff in the chat and let's see how it goes. Keeping it very flexible. So I thought I'd start off with some challenges, some healthy challenges for all of us, really. They're quite contentious. I should have given you a health warning before I put them up on the screen. So here's the first one. Are we managing the statistic or are we managing the risk? Now have a think about that. I can give you some feedback. There is quite a groundswell out there, particularly people at the sharp end that think that we're predominantly managing the statistic. And they'll back that up by things like, do you know what? We do lots of great things here. We know how dangerous it can be. But if someone stumbles on some uneven ground and breaks their ankle, it results in a lost time accident and the sky comes down on top of us. Everybody comes along to investigate it. Now, okay, that's a perception, but if you think that a perception is a person's reality, really, so if it's a reality out there, we have to really ask ourselves, are we perceived at managing the statistic or are we managing the risk? The second one, what level of engagement do we have with the people at risk? And I'm talking here about real engagement, not where we get a nod from the people that we're talking with, the people who are predominantly at risk. We need more than that. Are we really engaged? And in Setters, we use an acronym. It's not a very catchy acronym, I'm afraid. It's called EKUA. And it's almost a challenge, that acronym. It's a challenge on whether we've got E, quality engagement with people, and we're getting response back to them that we're getting quality engagement. The K is, are we actually sharing real knowledge with people? Or I'm going to get quite a lot into kind of conscious and subconscious competence. And I've heard it said a number of times, in fact, a significant number of times, they won't get this. So we can't share all the kind of psychology behind what goes on in terms of making choices. So that obviously is a challenge to real engagement. What evidence do we have that people have understood? You know, are we seeing that understanding of psychology, which influences our choices? You'll hear me using the same words over and over again this evening. But do we know whether people actually understand? What kind of feedback mechanisms have we got? And last but not least, are they applying the knowledge and the bits that they do understand? So EKUA, I say not very catchy, but it's a really important acronym. And I think it's an important acronym for all of us to have kind of by our side and check in with it. And then last but not least, how can leaders, managers, and supervisors influence a step change in thinking concerning health, safety, and well-being? Well, I guess first of all, I've got to convince you that there is a step change. And hopefully I can do that tonight. There is a step change, in my opinion. I've witnessed a step change many, many years ago when I was an offshore installation manager on oil platforms. And we didn't realize the step change at the time of the Piper Alpha. You know, I actually was an offshore installation manager on a platform identical to the Piper Alpha, which was the Thistle platform. And I was making very similar choices to the people on the Piper Alpha. So quite pointedly, I probably wouldn't be with you now. So there was a step change that we didn't recognize in those days. And I still think that step change is the same now. And I still think there's a lack of recognition of that. And it's really the balance between people being safety conscious and being safety subconscious and getting that balance right. It's not one or the other, it is a balance of the two. Okay, so let's start with something which is very familiar ground. And most of you could take me through this, the Bradley curve. The safety favorite, I think it is really, isn't it? Started back in the 60s really by a guy called Vernon Bradley, who hailed from the steel industry or spent a lot of time in the steel industry. And I think I'd like to kind of come at this curve from some different perspectives and challenge our thinking. You know, because I guess all of you could draw the curve and you could actually tell me the segments where we progress through the performance in terms of safety. But I'd like you to kind of just come on a journey with me. So we all know that the curve looks something like that. It's worthwhile remembering that we're talking about fatalities here. You know, this graph represents fatalities, and Vernon Bradley didn't have a great deal of problem in counting fatalities. You know, in the steel industry alone, we never got below double figures in terms of fatalities in 1 year. In fact, I can remember the number being up somewhere around about the 50 per year. I know that sounds incredible back in the 60s, but we used to have zany conversations like, you know, that's totally unacceptable. We recognized it was unacceptable, but because we didn't have a belief in zero harm, we accepted there would be some fatalities and we tried to beat the number that we experienced the year before. I know that sounds obscene to some of you who are a lot younger, but that was as good as it got in those days. We couldn't see ourselves getting down to a zero harm kind of situation, which we achieve quite regularly now in industry. So that's the curve. And we're talking about 850 in round figures in the 60s that used to get killed at work. And then the number now, I think Andrew just said the number's around about 111 now, something like that. It's 100 plus anyway. And every one of those is one too many, obviously. And the curve shows us that we've actually started to parallel. And what is that parallel? So let's have a look where we've started to kind of bring the numbers down before we've got to that paralleling, if you like. And we obviously in the days when there was 850 fatalities, we had to do something. And particularly in the 70s when the Health and Safety at Work Act came in, it really focused attention. I'd like to say positively focused attention, but there was a sting in the tail, because if we got it wrong, then individuals could be prosecuted and worse and imprisoned, and particularly people who were in kind of responsible, accountable positions in industry. So it was a healthy, positive, that we really had to do something about this. And we had to kind of collaborate to do something about it. And we did it really well. We got the numbers down significantly, as you can see from the curve. But obviously we couldn't go on like that. And we had to do something. We couldn't keep reacting. So we started to think about, how can we produce procedures which follow the trends that we've experienced in terms of these fatalities? And how can we systemize the working, and how can we explain to people what the risks are and get them to work in a consistent way to obviate the risks? So it became kind of systematic. Still got some improvements from that, but less so. Then we realized that although we had the procedures there, did people really understand why the procedures were there? And did they really appreciate the importance of following those procedures? So we started to train people. And we got to around about the 70s now, where there was a lot of trainings of people as individuals. Let's get people to a level of competence to be able to cope with the risks that they face. And then we thought, well, that's okay, but no person is an island. So can we manage, even with the highest level of training, to look after ourselves? And we soon realized that we've got to have and recognize the importance of interdependence, and how I guess it's an old phrase, but brother's keeper, where, we can actually look after each other. When someone could be falling foul of a particular hazard and not be aware of it, then someone in the vicinity would warn them about that and have a conversation. So we're very much at that stage now of interdependency. I think we all recognize that, but how good are we at interdependency? I would question that, quite frankly. Are we actually tapping into peer influence out there? Do we really know what goes on when no one is watching? Now there's a challenge, because that becomes very personal, doesn't it? How safe are any of us when no one is watching compared to when someone is watching? And I think we really have to go there, because particularly the way work patterns are now, there's more remote working. There's a lot of kind of at least just two people working together. It can be sole and lone working. How do we actually have a conversation with someone about the hazards they face and how they can almost be their own peer influence? How can we get them to a mindset where they can actually see the hazards that they're facing and perceive them accurately, as opposed to a misperception? You've all heard the phrase, I've done this job for 25 years, I've never had an accident. So how does that person perform when they're on their own? And that has to be the ultimate target. So yeah, we're all trying to achieve zero. We're still striving to get there, but we are suffering from this parallel. And I guess you'll have your own names for it, but I call it unreservedly the choice gap. Because we've got to the stage now where the locus of influence has definitely shifted to the people at risk. No matter what we think where else we sit in the organization, it is the people at risk that make the critical choice prior to the accident. And that would be somewhat easy if it was a conscious choice. But most of the accidents that we are experiencing have significant elements of subconscious choice. In other words, people have tended to have done the job in a certain way for a period of time. It's become habitual. Nobody else knows about it. Perhaps some of the peer group know about it, but they've not mentioned it and they're not entered into a conversation. So it's almost like the sword of Damocles. It's just waiting to happen to us. And of course, this is reinforced by, I think most of us realize, and the HSE realize, psychologists realize, that 96% of work accidents are down to unsafe behaviors. So it is that locus of control. Who is actually in control of those behaviors, be they safe or be they unsafe? And I think we have to conclude, in fact, I know we have to conclude, it is the person at risk. So if we can shift our mentality, our mindset into how do we best share knowledge with the people at risk? How do we best support them? And how do we actually create a real what's in it for me? Now that might seem strange when the outcome could be, serious injury or a fatality. And you think, isn't that enough to persuade people to get on board with this and think, it is down to me at the end of the day? But I guess we all know you can show gory photographs over and over again, but humans are incredibly resilient. And they will console themselves in the fact that, well, that was terrible, wasn't it? But it couldn't possibly happen to me. So we almost have to create some healthy vulnerability in people and actually kind of share with them that their thinking may be skewed in this respect, that no one has got a zero risk perception, although we perceive that we have. So I hope nobody's left the room so far, that you're still with me. So I know this is kind of really playing with the mind, playing with your head a little bit. Or is it? I'm sure you knew a lot about this yourselves anyway. And this is the outcome that we face. If we don't get this right, we don't just have more accidents, we have a higher severity with the ones that we have. Because if you think about it, we did have some early warning systems when we were experiencing accidents. We could at least trend these, and it seemed to be a more meaningful conversation with people out there that they were aware that someone else at least had had an accident and it could possibly happen to them. But we're going for days and days now without any accidents. So we're actually storing up high severity ones because we don't know where the next one is going to happen. And it's really sad, but we often get called in after a fatality with an organization, where on paper they seem to have been doing really well, and then bang, they get a severity in the form of a fatality. And one organization that we work for actually had 2 of them, where if you looked at and if you audited them, they were pretty good, and they still are very good, but they still experienced 2 fatalities. And that to me reinforces the fact that we have to kind of share with people an understanding of the choices they make, particularly the balance between subconscious choices and conscious choices, so that they can protect themselves with the support of the rest of the organization. And it's interesting, I've been looking at choice, since the kind of Piper Alpha, that word kept cropping up for me. It's all about choice. And it's only recently that I looked up the dictionary definition of it, which seems rather weird. But I was quite pleased that I did, because there were 2 3 definitions of choice, really. I got 2 out of 3, and I've been studying this for years and years and years. And I got the first 2, that choice is all about options. And I even got the second one, that choice is all about alternatives. But the third one more than pleased me, because it said choice is about possibilities. And I really do see that sharing a real understanding of choice in a way that people can assimilate it in their language, taking into account that how people take in information, and really triggering a what's in it for me, because the kind of choice I'm talking about here, subconscious choice, is exactly the same kind of subconscious choice which leads to subconscious competence. Not easy to say this all the time, by the way. So subconscious competence is all about peak performance in anything that you want to be excellent at. So if you want to excel in anything, you have to have a balance between conscious competence and subconscious competence. So when we convey this message to people, they start to take it on board personally and think, this is more than safety. It's even more than safety, health, and well-being. This is how I make the choices which influence my life. And the first place that people take this newfound understanding is home. And they tend to use it with their loved ones, particularly children and grandchildren, and start to have a different type of dialogue with children and grandchildren. So they're getting into this realms of subconscious competence and an understanding of it. Okay. I'm not forgetting, we could go off on a wonderful journey here and we could get into all of the psychology, but I'm passionate about bringing this back and landing it so that it's sustainable. And I think this is where lots of our competitors perhaps don't actually stress this enough. They tend to ride this kind of surf this wave of, isn't this interesting? But to me, it's only interesting if we can sustain it. And the way we sustain it is to play back the outcomes from the discussions we have, from the coaching and mentoring that we can have between each of us at all levels, and play it back into a challenge to the systems we have. And unless I'm very much mistaken, people will be going, do you know what? Those systems aren't real to us. They're good on paper, but think how they were constructed. They tended to be constructed after we'd had a real serious accident. So we really tighten things up. And yet, once that accident has passed us, we're still trying to live with those same sort of tensions, and we don't do the job that way. So are we almost creating an environment here when people find it really difficult to follow the system? But no one's saying that the king's got no clothes on. So it'd be really interesting to see how the newfound understanding of choice opens people up to give us pure feedback, and then we can start to have a real review of our systems. And how many safety professionals have got that on their Christmas list? I'd love the people at risk to work with me on producing the best systems. And here's an opportunity, in my opinion. Okay, so subconscious choice. Let's have a look at what that is in some practicality. So I talked before about people having a personal risk perception of 0, a likelihood of it happening to me. I don't know how many of you think that that's the case, but if I asked you a simple question, that what would you rather be in a car, the driver or the passenger? Don't give too much thought about it. And I'm not asking you to put it on the chat line, but if I was a betting man, I'd say most of us have just said, I'd rather be the driver. So what evidence have we got to support that? Why do we think that when we're in control, everything will be all right? And I'm much better than the other person who is purporting to drive. And if we have that mindset, what kind of behavior would we perform when we're sitting in the passenger seat? Would we be kind of reaching for the imaginary brake? Would we be watching the driver and every move that they made? And what effect would that have on the driver? I can tell you one effect it would have. It would get that driver to be starting to drive the car consciously, because they'll be thinking someone's watching me, instead of driving it subconsciously. And guess what? The passenger then gets reinforcement. I am the better driver. Now, a very simple example, but I think that example holds for most things, that we have to create some protection zone around ourselves in terms of our personal risk perception. Because let's be honest, some of us wouldn't even go into the workplaces that we're asked to go into if we just thought about the risk. You know, we have to have some protection that we can manage that risk. But 0, that's a bit of a kind of tall ask, isn't it? But let's assume it was 0 or a low number. So what would that enable us to do? So what if we had an opportunity of doing the job a bit quicker? Isn't it funny how nobody ever says to you when they're teaching you how to do the job, I'll show you the long way how to do this. It's always, I'll show you the short way to do this. I think we have to accept that we are natural time-saving devices as humans. We are hardwired to save time. That's why when we overtake a car, and it could be in a bit of a kind of a not too clever situation, but there's a drive inside us that makes us overtake that car. And yet deep down, we know we're going to meet up with the same car at the traffic lights. What is it that gives us that drive? And in one word, it's mortality. It's our awareness that we are mortal. So we are hardwired to save time. So when we're presented with an opportunity of saving time, we will save it. We often offset this by saying, it wasn't me, it was the company that put that kind of time pressure on me, or they expected me to get the job done quicker. Those aren't always true. I think you have to recognize that we are natural time-saving devices, so we'll always take a shortcut, particularly if we've got a personal risk perception of 0. It's easy. We're not taking much of a risk. And we call it the 168 drive because it's literally 168 hours in a week. So if we do that and we have success at taking that shortcut, when we actually do the job the next time, do you think we're going to go back to the old way of doing it and take the longer route? Not likely, is it? It worked the first time, so we'll do it the second time. Repeat that, and that figure of 21 days comes up, which lots of people will give us an average length of time to create a new habit. So if we do it enough times and practice that job in a certain way, including that shortcut, it will become the habitual way that we do the job. Okay, you can argue about the 21 days, don't hold me to that, but it's of that average. Just think of the diets, you know, the first week, you're really up for it. The second week, the odd chocolate biscuit's okay. The third week is really whether it works or not. Most of us have been there because your habits have changed. So we're now into the zone of automatic subconscious routines. And when we're in that zone of automatic subconscious routines or habits, we are now not exercising any judgment. We're getting subconsciously competent at doing the job in this way. So we're not even questioning it. In fact, it gives us another facility here now. We can even do the job that way without thinking about it. And then that brings in another concept, which is called alpha trance state. You know, the one where your mind and body is in two different places. The one where the car appears in the drive and you seem to be in the driving seat but can't remember most of the journey. But you seem to accomplish the journey successfully and safely. So you've been driving the car subconsciously for a large part of the journey. So now you've adopted this habit that you can actually do it without even thinking about it. And when the psychologists say that we spend at least 10 minutes in every hour in this alpha trance state, so we must be exposed for at least 10 minutes in every hour, even if we were using some judgment. And when we're in alpha, our risk awareness fades even more until it's almost insignificant. It no longer exists. We can't even remember that we took a shortcut in the first place. And then if we get away with it, which we probably will on most occasions, it reinforces the belief. So now we've trapped a habit in there that was never risk assessed in the first place. It was based on kind of perceived or faulty perception of the risk. And now it is the way that we do the job. Now, if observation came into it, it would be interesting because if someone observed someone doing the job, you can temporarily come out of this habit consciously and show someone what you think they want to see. And this must challenge observations, because what are the outputs of observations really? Are they actually what goes on in the workplace, or are they what people choose to show us what goes on in the workplace? So observations in their own right aren't really the answer. We've got to create sufficient of a peer influence so that people who share the same subconscious routines can actually healthily and respectfully challenge each other. Okay, so what could be the outcome of all of this? Well, you could say it's a vicious circle, but I prefer to call it a downward spiral. There's almost an inevitability about this, that it is the accident waiting to happen. And the kind of accident that's waiting to happen there is the severity spike, linking it back to the Bradley curve. I'm pausing there intentionally for you to think about that. Okay, so I guess we've concluded at this stage. It's got to be something to do with culture. It's got to be something to do with mindset. We could talk for days about mindset, couldn't we? So I've chosen one aspect of mindset. I could have chosen conditioning, values, beliefs, feelings and emotions, the behavior that emanates from all of those. But to me, the key one is attitude. And the reason I say that is because another dictionary definition, by the way, if you look it up, it says that attitude is your chosen response to a given situation. And the thing about attitude is you can change your attitude instantaneously, literally by a flick of the fingers. So we can actually influence people quite dynamically in terms of attitude. Whereas some of the other things, when you're talking about mindset, they're much more kind of deep-rooted than that. It's not so easy to change beliefs. But attitude can be changed. And the other thing I like about attitude is that it's extremely contagious. So if someone positively changes their attitude, the likelihood is that it will influence someone next to them. So you can create kind of tipping points and turning points here if you kind of focus on attitude. So when we start off a project with any organization, we tap into what are the attitude levels existing in the organization currently? And we use this scale. Now, okay, this scale isn't kind of a label that we stick on someone's forehead to say that this is the attitude that they always adopt. But it does actually reveal the attitude which someone is likely to adopt by the way that they answer the questions. Now we come out with something like this. We use a playing analogy. So with someone with a positive attitude and a high level of energy, we say that they're playing for an organization. And by playing, we mean it's the kind of person that goes or says, I've got an idea. I think we can do this better. And they've got high energy, so they are quite insistent about the fact that they've got an idea. And they're trying to encourage people around them. They're great people to have around, but they don't always fit into the category of completer. So they need someone else to help them to complete this great idea and to support them. And strange enough, we call those supporters. They've got the same level of attitude, but just slightly lower levels of energy. And we all have different levels of energy. But the combination of the two is very dynamic, because you want people there that are really keen to help themselves and the organization get better, and you want people who will support that. So if I were to ask you rhetorically again, you obviously realize there's a line there, which is an attitude hurdle, but how many people in percentage terms do you think you may have in your organization who are playing and supporting without knowing what's below that line? You might kind of pop the number in the chat, but I'm quite good at guessing. And I guess they may range from about 30% to perhaps even 70%, 80%. I'm putting words in your mouth. Both are right, by the way. And both are good news. Because if it's 70%, I think there's only a handful of occasions where we've seen less than 70% above the line. And that shows how many people there are who want to actually work for the organization. Now, for those who have got lower numbers than that, I totally understand that, because there is a drag factor below the line, which skews the number you've got above the line. And it can be as low as 20%. You know, some organizations have said, oh, about 20% if we're lucky. But what potential is being missed there? If we're getting a feedback that it's 70% and they're thinking it's 20%, that must be a great incentive to kind of change the mindset there and influence the mindset positively. But the drag factor is significant, and it comes in these forms. So if you've got someone with a low level of energy and a low level of attitude, if you like, or a negative attitude even, we call these people in that quadrant sleepwalking. It's their behavior that's demonstrated as sleepwalking. So if you've got a player saying, I've got a great idea, and the supporter says, I'd like to help you with that, the sleepwalker would tend to say something like, do you know, I'm not really interested. Don't involve me. I'm okay. I'll come in, I'll do my job, pay me, I'll go home. Now, there can be a whole host of reasons why people adopt that stance, and you can probably think of a number of them. But they're just ticking over. They're not going to cause any harm, but they're not really going to break any records. You can live with that, although you prefer people not to be in that mode when they're spending 2/3 of their life in that mode through work. But the real problem area is people with high levels of energy and very negative attitude, and they form, depending on their level of self-esteem, whether it's low or whether it's almost pathologically high, they fall into the first category is sniping. And the kind of things that people would say here, the player would say, I've got a great idea, yeah, I want to support that. No, count me out, I'm not really interested. The sniper would say, here we go again. The managers are coming up with another kind of initiative. We've seen it all before. They talk a good game, but they don't really mean it. They don't really care about us. They're only managing the statistic. They're not really managing the risk. No, don't get sucked in by it. Just play the game, and then we kind of go back to what we were always doing, or worse, because they are suffering from low self-esteem, I would contend. So the more attention they get, the louder and louder they become. It's a bit like the naughty child syndrome. And that would be bad enough, except that there are people behind the throne who are undermining. And these are the ones that say, They don't just say, don't bother. They're saying things like, I'll make sure it doesn't work. I will actually scupper this. They don't deserve it to work. You know, it's a lot more kind of robust, unfortunately, negatively robust. And you think, why do people actually adopt those sort of attitudes? There's a whole host of reasons why, which I won't go into today, but you can imagine some of them. Just you've had experience of people dropping down to those levels. Is this redeemable? It is. But a trap that most of us fall into, where do we tend to, if we're honest, focus our attention? Do we focus our attention with the majority of people who are playing and supporting? Or do we focus our attention on the ones who are below that attitude line? Is there part of us that think this is a real challenge? I've got to help to turn them. And yet, what does that feel like if you're one of the players and supporters, seeing them getting more attention than they are getting? So it's not an easy solution, but we have to start by kind of really working on the players and supporters, because the players and supporters have got high self-esteem. They've got enough self-esteem to lend to the ones down below with the low self-esteem. The ones in that bottom corner, you're probably never going to change. There's only one person that can change them, and that's themselves. You can create an environment where it gets really difficult for them to exist, and they may kind of jump that hurdle, but it's unlikely. They're so deep-rooted, it's going to be really difficult to get them to change. But there's a big prize in terms of the ones with high self-esteem helping the ones with lower self-esteem. And you should make a significant shift. Okay. So, how do we do it? So, I guess two words really. It's in the style of engagement. And the two words are really coaching and mentoring. You know, you can't create a culture by decree. You can't make people get on board. You have to create the environment for them to come on board. And it is coaching and mentoring. And I couple the two. I don't think it's just coaching. It is coaching and mentoring. It's recognizing all the skills that exist in the organization and positioning people that they can share those skills so that they can give people a leg up, if you like. Not saying this is the only way to do it. So if you couple the kind of mentoring and coaching together, you've got an ideal blend. And there's enough people in the organization at all levels who will make and are, if they're allowed to be, very good mentors and coaches. But do we tap into that, or do we rely on hierarchy to get us out of this? So if you assume that a lot of those coaches would work from a position of peer influencing as opposed to hierarchical, let's encourage them to do so. Let's make them aware of the difference they can make, and let's work with them so that they can enhance their coaching and mentoring skills. And coaching and mentoring really influences people by those R's down that right-hand side there. It's all about how you gain respect from people and give respect. It's all about how you recognize people, recognize them for who they are, so that you can have shared goals for the business. That people at every level can actually feel as if they're contributing to the business as well as contributing to their own benefit. I think it's like the guy at NASA when he was sweeping up and someone said to him, you know, what's your role? He said, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. You know, it's that sort of context, really. It's giving people reassurance. It's boosting their confidence. The reward bit isn't as strong as you think it is. The reward comes from the previous three. Lots of people will settle for that reward. Okay, it's nice to get reward in terms of finance, but it's not all about finance for most people. And responsibility might seem like a strange bed partner, but giving people responsibility is recognizing the other four. You must have respect for them, recognition, and we want to reward them, and giving them reassurance by giving them responsibility. So there's nothing kind of brand new about this. It's using a lot of kind of, you know, things that you know intuitively, but getting the right blend of them. So I said earlier on, it's all about educating people at the sharp end so they can make the best choices. and then positioning the rest of the organization so they can support that. You know, lots of thinking out there is, if you get the leaders on board here, it will all happen by magic. There's one hell of a lot to get through for a leader to influence people at the sharp end. Yes, they're needed. They're needed to kind of create the direction, create the culture, certainly with their direct reports to kind of pass on the right messages to their direct reports. But to expect them to make the difference at the sharp end, not going to happen, quite frankly. And I'm privileged to kind of coach with lots of the leaders of the organizations we work with. I haven't heard one of them that said, I get out there as much as I would like to get out there. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I don't get out there anywhere near as much as I'd like to get out there. Okay, make the impact while you're out there, but you've got to have a kind of effective delegation here to get the messages down to the sharp end. So how do we communicate currently is a good place to start, in my opinion, not creating something new. So if we're focusing on individuals and the choices they're making, then how confidently can we say we actually focus on the supervision? That's quite a leading question. You know, lots of the supervisors come from the core teams that they're now supervising. That's a challenge in itself. But there's an opportunity there if it's played in the right way. They are aware of some of the subconscious routines. We need to have more kind of intimacy between the supervisors and the core teams. Not kind of promoting supervisors so that they're quasi-managers, which is taking them away from the workplace. You know, to be able to influence this, you've got to be sharing the same subconscious routines. Now, okay, a supervisor won't share exactly the same subconscious routines. There will always be some gap there, but they've got to be credible and be able to talk with the teams and create an environment where teams are sharing back what actually goes on out there. So it's not supervising so much. I haven't got a term for it really, but I think it's more supervision helps us, where supervision almost kind of gives you the feel that they're part of the team. They're not overseeing the team necessarily. And if you look at the solid line there, let's have a look at what supervisors do at the moment. You know, they'll set people to work, they'll go through risk assessments and method statements. Let's look at how they can do that in a better way. You know, there's one organization we work for in Malawi, it's in sugar plantations, and they've come up with a term, instead of saying toolbox talks, they call them toolbox asks. Wow, what a difference that one word makes in terms of an invitation. It's a toolbox ask. So they go, what's happening today, guys? How are we going to do that job? What kind of risks are we facing? And the real last one they ask is, why are we doing it that way? Now, so come up with why we're doing it, the hazards that we're covering, but is there a better way? And they just follow that simple procedure and they call them toolbox asks. And they've created a new dimension in terms of relationship between the supervision and the core teams out there. Now, if you get those right, so it allows the supervisor to do speed coaching, as we call it, and get part of the peer influencing, then on this left-hand side, on the dotted line, they can give more recognition to people out there in the teams. And they can start to build up self-esteem and start to help people to grow and develop their teams. So how can managers help? Well, a question I would like to ask all managers is, do they feel accountable for the safety management system? And what do you think the answer might be? I think most of them would say, not really. Isn't that the domain of the supervisor? You know, I'm a technical manager. I can't feel kind of accountable for the safety management system, but there's a clue in the phrase. It is a safety management system. They should be supportive of the quality of that safety management system, even if they don't directly employ it as a supervisor would. And it gives them the opportunity again through the solid line then to have a real supportive conversation with the supervisor about what kind of feedback you're getting from the teams. Have we got these procedures right? You know, what's the feeling out there? It gives the manager a much better opportunity of having a meaningful conversation with the supervisor. And we find in most organizations, I'm sure you've got a phrase for this, but we call it the clay layer. And the clay layer exists between the manager and the supervisor. It seems to be a real sticky wicket getting through that. and getting them to have meaningful conversations. And of course, that allows them on the dotted line for their manager to convey what they think about the culture and how they think the culture should be and support their supervisor. Last but not least, you've got the leaders. So in terms of this solid line there, we've got performance reviews. How much does the performance review feel like a statistical outcome? You know, the stats look okay, so safety, health and well-being must be okay. I know I'm exaggerating to make a point here, but I bet it's not far off that. Does it drill much deeper than that? Does the leader see this as an opportunity to coach and mentor each of their direct reports? And how do they kind of help to grow and develop their managers? I think the answer must be work in progress. There's certainly more opportunity there. Okay. I'm cracking through this. So I'm going to really blow your minds penultimately here. Okay, so if we're targeting zero harm, and we'll all have a version of zero harm, and we could probably take the rest of the evening talking about our different versions, but let's assume we've got to get safety as good as it can get. And let's assume that zero harm kind of covers that base. I have trouble with the Bradley curve, although I've been kind of indoctrinated it over the years. For me, it's upside down. I like a curve, if I'm getting better, to go up. So if we put the Bradley curve in like that and have it looking as if we're gaining ground towards zero, if some of the things I've been talking about this evening came into play, like we really could tap into peer influence, we really could get much better relationships between leaders, managers, supervisors, and core teams. If we could create an openness where the feedback from the core teams is pure, that they feel confident to be able to feedback what actually goes on out there. If people feel that they're growing because they're now making better choices in terms of health, safety, and well-being, and personally, and lo and behold, they're getting better at all sorts of other things because they're using the same sort of understanding of choice. Put all those things together, and I would contend that the graph above the line could look like that. That we'll pick up on the parallel line, then we'll gain such confidence that we'll start to go exponential. Now, if that were to be the case, it may not be quite as exponential as that, but if that were to be the case, we can create something which I call cultural headroom. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we eliminate the hazard. The hazard would still be there, but we've got such a peer influence openness that if someone was to fall foul of the risk imminently, someone would have that conversation with them. And I'd go as far as even to say, if the person was on their own, they would have the conversation with themselves. And if you think that's utopia, I'll give you a very quick example of one organization we work with. They install smart meters. And one of the guys installing the meters, he went to this particular household, and I think the lady must have been a little bit lonely anyway. She was craving company, and she was feeding him tea and biscuits, and he was being very polite, and he was talking with her, and da-da-da-da-da. Then he goes back to his van after completing the job, and he just thought to himself, I can't remember doing my checks. Now that seems incredible that he can't remember a few minutes earlier that he did his safety checks. He thought, I'm not leaving it there. He went back to the household again, more tea and biscuits. And he goes and checks, and he got the wrong polarity, never mind not doing the checks. The first thing he did when he got back to the van was reported it to his supervisor. And his supervisor said, do you realize what you're doing here? Do you realize how you're exposing yourself, sharing that information? He said, yeah, I do. But I can tell you for certain, I'm not the first one that's done that. Now, if you can create that sort of environment with one person, surely we can create it amongst a number of people where you can influence their attitudes so that they kind of start to pick up on how critical this peer influence is in the coaching and mentoring. Then even if we have the potential of a spike, we should be able to head it off at the pass. So, style of engagement, you might find it strange that I put policing on there, but of course you have to keep doing some of the things that we do now. If someone was in imminent danger, you wouldn't say, never mind, I'll catch them in the break and we'll have a little chat about it over a cup of tea. You know, you've got to take executive action there and then and stop the job. So all of these things come into play. We call it surfing the rainbow. So training plays a part, but I think I'd still put training as knowledge transfer. There's no evidence that people have taken it on board or are going to use it. Advising is still a tell. You'll hear things like, if I was you, I'd do it this way. The problem with that is you're not them. So it's not very congruent. So to me, it's got to be more coaching and mentoring to get us up in that kind of creation of cultural headroom. And in terms of cultural maturity, pathological, hopefully we've passed that, long past, but we're still reactive and we always will be reactive to things that go on. We still need to review our systems and get them better, but we should now be in the proactive and the generative range, where there's in generative, there is an interdependence and it's working really well. And the feedback that we're getting from the people at risk is pure, so that we can identify trends and work with them. So, some words to finish with. The ways of thinking cannot be changed unless the concrete signs given by the chain of command evolve. You know, so there has to be very clear signals from the leaders that this is the new way ahead for us. This is the one we really believe in. This is how we think we can make a real difference. And you get the culture you deserve as a leader, manager, and supervisor, because it's your choice. Or as they say in Malawi, Chisanko Changa, which is even better because it means my choice. Thank you.
Graham, thank you very much for what is obviously an informative and interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it, very valuable. And I can see we've got some questions. I must admit, probably 3 of them are from me, but as I'm speaking, there are a lot of people on this call, over 50. So please, whilst Graham goes through the first of these, please don't hold back. Let's have some questions. So I'm going to pass you over to Rasilla now, who will go through the chat box and see what's in there. So over to you, Rasilla, and back to Graham.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Graham, for a brilliant presentation. That was really interesting. So the first question I've got here is from Andrew. To what extent do you think conditions also are an important factor in accident causation?
Absolutely. But isn't it strange that I guess some of you will share this experience? Just one of the platforms I was on, Clover Thistle, was known colloquially as the Black Pig. Now you can probably glean from that, it wasn't the best platform in the world. But I tell you what, the safety was really good. It almost had the opposite effect. But you're absolutely right. You know, this has got to embrace everything that we're currently doing, and conditions are really important because they send a message. But a lot of the conditions can be improved by the teams themselves. You know, they're actually kind of focusing on what are the most important things, perhaps rather than just having them as a checklist that we kind of knock off. You know, what's the really important things here? Let's focus on the real kind of things that can hurt us. You know, let's keep focused on that risk severity and look at the conditions which are related to that. But you're right, Andrew, yes, of course they do have an impact.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Graham. The next one is from Andrew as well. So, do you recognise the shortcut approach in the build-up to the Buncefield explosion, where the control room operators accepted working with a faulty fill gauge for the fuel tank?
I accept it happens, and I think this is the kind of conversation we've got to have with people, why it happens, because they beat themselves up, you know, that they took the shortcut. When people understand that it is a natural human tendency to kind of search for this shortcut and implement it, it positions them better to challenge themselves. That may not be the answer you're looking for, Andrew, but I think we have to accept that we are naturally kind of hardwired to create shortcuts. But it's having the dialogue, almost doing that dynamic risk assessment. You know, we might have a better way of doing the job, but the shortcuts I'm talking about are the ones that haven't been risk assessed. You know, you're just thinking of the outcome. Oh, it's quicker, we'll do it. I don't mind a shortcut as long as there's a risk assessment associated with it and a team risk assessment, so you're getting different perspectives.
Thank you. Can I just come back on that? Yeah, I think I'm not really an expert on Buncefield, but from what I remember, the operators just got used to the fact that the visual fuel fill gauge just was unreliable, and it used to pack up because of lack of maintenance. So they just got used to it because they relied on the fact that there was a top level switch probe plus valve that would stop any overfilling accident.
Spot on.
Obviously, the accident tells us it didn't work, and that's another story. But they were relying on something that, and they had no idea, of course, that the conditions were such that if they overfilled, there would be no safety net for them. So it sounds to me that what you're describing about how people adapt to the situation, even if it's not perfect, and they manage for a long, long time. You know, their ordinary working lives were to operate in that way.
Well, I'll bare my soul to you, Andrew, because I'm, you know, as an offshore installation manager, I've been in control rooms where an alarm would go, and without anybody saying anything, the person nearest to the alarm cancelled it because the alarms would have habitually gone. And okay, we worked it out that, you know, it was a faulty alarm or whatever it might have been, and you didn't even think about it. You just think and cancelled it. So I think a lot of us are guilty of that, but of course we didn't fully appreciate what we were doing.
Yeah, and I think there is also what you said, Graham, about your personal risk perception as well, that people always think it happens to other people.
Yes.
Rather than themselves. So, you know, they can get away with it. They have been for so long.
And another thing, really, if you think, you know, this wasn't malintent, but the first question I was asked every morning as the offshore installation manager was, how much oil and gas did you pump last night? Now, there was no malintent by that. But what I wonder what effect that had on some of us, including me. How much oil and gas did you pump last night? What would the focus have been? You know, if we sorted that alarm or just cancelled it, if we take the second option, it's the better one in terms of pumping oil and gas.
Yeah, thank you for that, Graham. So I've just got a question actually. So how do you encourage employees to speak up, especially if the organisation has a blame culture? Because I was quite intrigued by that example you gave, that, you know, it was such an open organisation that he could own up to his mistake.
It's confidence, isn't it? It's building confidence in people and building up that groundswell of confidence where the peer influence almost protects the person who's speaking up. That it would be the person who challenged that one that's speaking up that would be the one that's isolated, as opposed to the person who actually spoke up. And what we've done in a number of organisations, we've linked their just culture approach to the safety side of it, because it can go the other way. We had one organisation that was saying things like, it wasn't my fault, I was in this alpha trans state thing. So you can go both ways. So we had to, and we did link it to just culture, and it worked okay then when you linked it back to just culture.
Yeah.
Good question, Ursula, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Another question from Andrew. So in your experience, now we're talking about just culture, how common is it for an organisation to operate a just culture with open reporting as described by James Reason and mostly used in the aviation industry?
Not very common, I think, except the aviation industry.
Yeah.
And similar, you know, they've learned the hard way, haven't they? So they're very good there. They're a model that we need to kind of all look at, really, and examine. And what they've done in the aviation industry, as Andrew knows as well, they've almost kind of, well, some organisations in it, like Southwest Airlines in America, have broken down the functional divides as well. You know, where there's not the kind of hierarchy where the pilot is God and no one can challenge a pilot. You know, everybody in their chain can challenge healthily and respectfully. You know, those are caveats, to say the least. But I still think we've got a way to go, particularly where you've got quite a lot of transient labour. You know, they don't feel confident to raise matters. That's where if you get the core team really working together, they actually encourage the transient labour to say what they think, because it's another pair of eyes, isn't it? You know, it's someone coming in from somewhere else and bringing their experiences with them and perhaps seeing something that the host don't see. but it's still work in progress. The best place we saw that is in Africa, in Malawi. It was a privilege working over there, and it still is. We're still working with them. They sucked this stuff up like a sponge, and they turned it into song, dance, and drama. And I've got to be honest, they did it better than we did. There's a surprise, isn't it? They're really good at song, dance, and drama. But they did it very eloquently, and they actually were filling their equivalent of football stadium with the tribes and people from the villages, the transient labour, and they were coming along to the event as if it was something that they really valued, you know, because they're passionate about growing.
Sounds very creative.
It was.
Yeah.
They didn't let me do the dancing though. They said it wasn't even dad dancing, it was granddad dancing.
Lovely, thank you. So we've got a question from Richard Sefton. So what would you say would be the first steps to help turn a negative culture around?
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it?
Great question.
I'm thinking really, it's got to be with the leadership, but not in the way that you think the leadership are going to be able to carry the message. It's got to be to convince the leadership that this can be a real benefit to the organisation, obviously in terms of health, safety and well-being. But the real prize is we're talking about performance improvement here. You know, we're talking about people excelling in subconscious competence. So there's a real drive. You know, most of the organisations we work with, I've got to say, have reported back all sorts of other things that they've got better at. There's a coincidence, not. So it does have to kind of start with, otherwise it doesn't get off the ground, it doesn't get funded, does it? But lots of our projects, some of the leadership have taken it on board, but we've known they've not really believed in it. But when they see the shift in the core teams, it's really kind of got them to think, hang on a bit, you know, this is something we'd be silly not to get on board with. I think we're all the same, we just need that little bit of convincing. But it's obviously got to start with the leadership, but very quickly go straight to the core teams and the supervision.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Graham. So next one we've got is from Doris. And sorry, I can't pronounce your surname, Doris, but Pejnishka. So how do you get the top management engaged to start with, so they are the real leaders to drive the positive culture? So it's sort of linked with the one before, really, isn't it?
It's a $64,000 question, isn't it? What we do is we look for someone within the host organisation that we can align with. And then it's got to be a partnership. You know, we have some, let's say, really interesting conversations at board level. And I have been heard to say, when someone at board level says, they won't get this, I say, well, my experience is you don't. Now that sounds really disrespectful. It's not, it's actually respectful. Because if you're very successful at what you do, why would you change? There's almost a kind of resistance to change in case you lose something. Whereas some of the core teams go, do you know what? I can see that working for me. And I think it's getting leaders to realize, you know, it's not one size fits all. One thing which is key though, everybody has to have the same message. You know, so we give people the same message, but in a different context, depending on where they sit in the business. Otherwise you can't have those cross-functional and hierarchical conversations. Because people at the sharp end will check in, are we just getting this, or are the leaders getting it as well? You know, and I don't blame them doing that. You know, they're looking for reassurance.
Yeah. Okay, lovely, thank you. So I've got another one from Heather Oliver. Do you have any tips on how to break through that clay layer to get the buy-in from managers?
Tips. I think it's a challenge more than a tip. You know, if you challenge them, what is the real relationship between the manager and their direct reports to supervision? And how can that be improved in terms of quality? So it almost gives people a start at the 10 to actually kind of get their hands on it, as opposed to kind of talking about it theoretically. That's the one for me that has made the most difference. you know, when we've had, again, back to Malawi, we had one of the supervisors chased us back to one of the camps we were going to. I thought, oh my gosh, what's this all about? And he wanted to say, he said to us, he said, I've tried this coaching with my team today and I got a totally different kind of response from them. And he was so enthused by getting that totally different response. So I think that's the real acid test. You know, get managers to kind of use some of this stuff and try it with openness with the supervisor. Have the conversation with the supervisor, get that dialogue going. And it takes time, you know, it doesn't happen overnight. You know, some of our programs might last 2-3 years.
Right, thank you, Graham. Right, we've got the last question here. Unless there's any more, please put them in the chat. So this is by Stephen Jameson. Where can we obtain successful case studies to help those who wish to start the conversation on behavioural-based safety and culture change with management?
That's easy, Stephen, just speak to me.
Okay.
No, genuinely, we're an open book, you know, so if you really wanted to start, I can take you through some case studies, show you some case studies and all sorts of things. Yeah, absolutely, no problem at all.
I've just got a comment here. Sorry, let me just try and get this. So it's from Gary Welch. So you're saying here, I found a good way to implement change was to get managers and supervisors to read the short story. Oh, who moved my cheese? Right.
Oh, yeah, good.
That's a good story, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, everything's kind of a contribution. There's all sorts of books out there. Turn the Ship Around is a really good one, actually, if you read that one. The Chimp Paradox is very much kind of uses the same techniques as we use. Any of you that's into NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, we use a lot of that in the program as well, because that's a lot of bringing together of psychology. Yeah, I think that the key is when you read a book, I think create your own core of what you think is the best way ahead. Then add what you get out of the book to that core. Otherwise, you tend to read lots of books, and I find it quite confusing. They're all apparently saying the same thing, but I can't pull them together. So I actually, this is terrible, but I underline every book that I read, and then I go through the underlines, and then I add it to my core. So you build up a strong core of understanding, I guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many of us have read a kind of self-help book, then when someone says, you really enjoyed that, didn't you? What did it say? And we all go, can't remember.
That's a great tip, Graham. I really like that. Building your own core of knowledge from different books. Brilliant. So I think that's all the questions we've got. Anyone else got any questions or anything? We've got some lovely comments in the chat.
That's nice.
We have. So don't want to embarrass you, Graham, by reading them all out now, but they're all very good. Okay, I'll read one to you. Thank you, Graham, for your time this evening in delivering a very interesting topic, and I think we would all agree with that. In fact, I found it fascinating because when I first saw your description of your presentation, I wasn't sure exactly in which direction it was going to go, but it seemed to tick all the boxes. And you know, when I started in safety, which is now 40 years ago, I came to the conclusion that there were one or two groups of people that you really had to get on board, otherwise nothing would be done. And you actually have a slide there that has them all on. So supervisors, I put it in the middle there, obviously managers and operators, and then the leaders, and how you've connected those together as well. That's a fascinating slide, which when we get this copied up hopefully onto the website, if you're happy, I'll have another look at it, because it was, for me, very, very interesting. And it touches so many subjects, I think, that we all as safety practitioners need to know about. There are behaviours that are difficult to manage. When we look at accidents, as you say, 96% of all accidents are behaviour based in one way or the other. I raised the other 4% because I think, as you agree, also very important, the conditions part of it. And if we can get to the bottom of that and copy what they're doing with just cultures and open reporting and putting your hand up and being honest, This would be fantastic. I also like your choice gap. I've never seen that referred to as a choice gap before on your Bradley curve.
Yeah.
And we've been looking at this this problem that you've outlined, which is leaders having problems with understanding that when they're usually it's the frequency index, so that's all of their incidents and accidents. A lot of them are minor and never would become the fatalities and the serious injuries. And they concentrate on zero accidents, they concentrate on this falling, and then, I'm not sure if this is where your spike comes in, but unfortunately, and I've seen this myself, along comes a fatality, and everybody said, well, where did that come from? And of course, they should have known, and they weren't looking. So we're all singing off the same hymn sheet, I think. So I will say on behalf of East Midlands Branch Executive Committee, I'd like to thank you formally for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. Looking at these remarks from others in the chat box, so did they. And I would certainly recommend you in future for this as well. So thank you very much indeed. I will ask just the few of us, the committee, to stay. That's two of us.